good to meet all of you, and really good to give you the class earlier on. Everyone did very well. I was actually very impressed with everyone's focus and attention. Because sometimes when people haven't done any geometry before, as I think some of you are in that situation, it can be, it can be a bit difficult, requires a bit more time. So everyone did really well. And I think I'm going to really get on with some of the stuff I'm going to show you here, because obviously the more I've been talking to everyone during dinner, I'm getting the sense that we're in a very, very similar area of interest. So I think this is going to be quite up your street. Now this is the front cover of the book, which I just published about half a year ago. It took me about 12 years to do it all. I didn't have any idea it was going to take that long. I mean, it's a very meandering project, very slow and gradual, but it was like an initiation for me, it really was. And the book ended up being about initiation at the end. The final section is all about initiation. I had no clue that that's what the last section was going to be about, but that's what came up really in the last section. But I think it's really best if I just get on with it, because I can talk about this endlessly, believe me. This is been about an hour long talk, but it can go on for ages, so watch out. Now, a recurring theme in lots of traditions is the idea of a middle path between the sun and the moon. Now, as you may recognise, this is where you're going to be going tomorrow. These are two images of Glastonbury. But this theme of the sun and the moon, I think, is just a good one to begin with, because it's going to be really quite a, well, I suppose I could say, central theme with the design of the cathedral that I'm going to show you. Of course, central is the very essence of what sun and moon is about. It's about the middle way between opposites, the middle path between light and dark, between all dualities. And I think I said in both of the geometry sessions about this third thing that brings opposites together. This is really the key philosophical theme that we focus on in geometry. Now, with the sun and the moon in mind, the Tibetan Buddha is very often depicted with sun and moon, and then that vertical middle, I suppose, axial part of the body of the Buddha passing between those two opposites. Now, you have really much the same thing in medieval Christianity with the sun and the moon on either side of the cross. And so the way of the cross, from the death of Adam, which is often shown as a skull below the ground, and then rising up like an ascending serpent, between the sun and the moon, back up to the heavenly origin. Now, if we look in alchemy, then of course this is what's happening with Hermes and his caduceus. The caduceus with the two serpents, again, sun and moon on either side, in the way of these two antagonistic opposites, bringing about the harmony and the peace between them by passing as the middle path between them. With the story of the caduceus, this staff of Hermes, he found two serpents in conflict, and so he took a stick and he separated them, and then they united around the stick. So it's the inclusion of this third thing which allows the two opposites to enter into a relationship. And this is, I suppose, he's the lord of polarities, Mercury in this sense, or Hermes. Now, looking further afield, of course, you have something very similar in the Indian tradition with Kundalini, and with the ascending serpents, one is the sun, one is the moon, going around the Sushumna, the middle path that they pass around. Now, a similar one in the Chinese tradition is Fuxi and Nuwa, male and female, brother and sister. One holds the compasses, one holds the set square. Moon below, sun above, half serpent, half human. So again, that duality in relationship. Now, I said about compasses and set square, which you can see in their hands there. This is another one of these dualities, which is really key to geometry. Now, this is from Freemason Hall in Covent Garden in London. The compasses is heaven, the set square is earth. And the uniting of those two brings about this third element, which in this case is the blazing star, or the pentagram, Venus rising in the east, and therefore associated with resurrection. Now, this is a really key theme I'm going to focus on with the design of the cathedral in Wales. So this this use of the pentagram as an image of resurrection. Now, I'll begin with a few thoughts about geometry, and these will perhaps, I don't think I emphasise this one quite so much. This is a very key Platonist theme. Geometry is essentially the embodiment of that which is eternal and unchanging. And so hence, of course, the importance of geometry in this sense. In a world of perpetual change, transformation and movement, there are still these things that are eternal and unchanging, and they are, of course, numbers. And geometry is quite simply the incarnation of number, or the embodiment of number. So to draw geometry is to actually participate in the eternal. I mean, the pattern we draw will come and go, that won't last forever. But to draw geometry is to participate in the eternal. Now, I definitely mentioned this a lot. This image here is a painting by John Michel, who's someone I've mentioned quite a lot in my book. Geometry is relationship. This is what it presents us with. It gives us really a harmonious image, I suppose you could say, of community. How community works in heaven, maybe not so much on earth, unfortunately, but there is this possibility of harmonious relationship where everything works together as one. All of the parts are different, so they don't need to all be the same as each other. They're all separate, they're all different, but in another sense they're all together as one. And the geometric pattern, again, is, I suppose, the visual image of this reality. Now, my teacher, Keith Critchlow, he wrote a book called The Hidden Geometry of Flowers. And this is something we talk about a lot, the geometry of flowers. These miraculous forms that just rise up and embody these geometric forms. No compasses, no set square, they just bring them forth through their very growth patterns. Now, the other place where we see lots of geometry is, of course, in the cosmos. And the word cosmos is the Greek word for order. It also means adornment, and so cosmetics, cosmos, same etymological root. But this association of beauty with order is implicitly there within these two meanings of cosmos. Now, the effect that the illumination of the sun has on the world is to make it green. So through photosynthesis, that greenness is naturally what springs forth. It's the natural reaction to light. So if we can think of greening as something that also takes place within the soul, perhaps we have a sense of the green man who is in the various cathedrals in the 12th century onwards. I would say that they're an image of the soul that has become green. The soul in whom the morning star has risen. And these amazing trees here, I was in a town just about a month ago in the Spanish Pyrenees called La Ciudad Gel. There's an amazing grove of trees, looking just like a cathedral. Of course, I see cathedrals everywhere, as you may imagine. But this was particularly a good image of one, and it just reminded me that, of course, this is a very important fact about cathedrals, that they are designed to look like a grove of trees. They are designed to give you a sense that you're in the natural world. Though, of course, in another sense, in a quite a different way, a non-organic way, in that sort of that eternity of stone. Now, the main thing I'm going to talk about in relation to the cathedral in the city of Wells, which you're going to be going around with me tomorrow, is how it is an image of the cosmos. Now, I hope you're all okay about this little insect wandering around the screen. I don't know how long it'll be, but it's very attached to what's going on. Now, what we'll look at is this. This will be some of the general geometry we'll look at. I'll come to it shortly. But you'll see the pentagram up at the east end there. Now, before we look a bit further at that, I just want to do one more thought in relation to geometry. Geometry begins with the circle, as you saw from the way we were drawing it earlier. That ideal form, which is essentially an image of unity, because every part of the circumference is equidistant from this one central point. Now, the central point of a circle technically has no body, in the sense that it's dimensionless. Because imagine if you look at a dot, if you look very closely at a dot, it has a centre and a very small circumference. So imagine if we look at the molecule at the centre of the dot, even that would be looked upon as having a centre and a periphery. So the centre itself is completely beyond our vision. But we know it's there because of everything that comes forth from it. When the circle becomes manifest, it presents that which is hidden. So with this in mind, if we think of the way of things, in the sense that everything begins from a hidden, unified source and then moves out into multiplicity. And so we have this with the circle and the sphere, this image of unity. Now with spheres in mind, of course, we're actually living on one, and we're in a universe absolutely full of these forms, which are expressive of centeredness, of unity, of the one. So the whole cosmos could be said to be just one image, one constant prayerful remembrance of the one. Now you've all been travelling for a few days now. This was in the news very recently, I don't know, you may have seen it. This is, I think, from the Hebrew University in Israel. These are 1.4 million years old, made by humans. And what's been concluded by these academics at the Hebrew University is that the way that they've been made clearly demonstrates that the people who made them were attempting to create a sphere. Now, as a geometer, this comes as no surprise whatsoever. The sphere, I suppose you could say, is what the soul looks like when it's in its true state. So we have this innate knowing of sphereness, if that doesn't sound too odd. I talk a lot about ness when we talk about geometry, threeness, fourness, sphereness as well. Now, just to the north of where you started your journey are found these petrospheres, carved stone walls. Most of them are very heavily concentrated around just north of Aberdeenshire. And one of the things, I haven't sort of shown this in a book yet, it's not in my current book, but I'm going to publish it soon. They're all a significant latitude north of the equator. They're 1 radian north of the equator. And these are spherical geometries. They're specifically embodying what are known as the Platonic solids, which are some of the shapes that Plato talks about in one of his dialogues. So again, spheres are this very significant form, and in various different ancient traditions there are these spheres that have been found. No one knows exactly what they're used for. The worst theory about these ones was that they were used to throw at each other. But the people, that probably says more about the person who made up the theory, I have to say. And so to this sphere, which of course has this association of death and rebirth, of life emerging from the centre of the spherical form, and of course it being an image of the sun rising in the east, in that resurrection and rebirth of the light. Now, in the session, I talked about the 7 days of the week and the 7 planets, and I'll now talk about them as the celestial spheres. Now, interestingly, with this, there's actually, you could say, an inversion of that hierarchy that I was just talking about. Rather than, I suppose you could say, the divine origin being at the centre, and then there being a movement outwards into manifestation, the celestial spheres of the ancient world are actually the opposite. There's the divine realm is on the outside. And then you have the celestial spheres gradually moving in to Earth, the most manifest form at the centre. So the divine realm is out here, and then you go to more and more materiality as you go to the centre. So it's an inversion of the way things usually are in terms of moving from the one to the many. Now here's an image associated with Hildegard of Bingen, the German mystic. Earth at the centre, then the moon, Mercury, Venus, Sun, big one, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn. So again, this movement through 7 levels, through the celestial spheres. Now the furthest one out, where eternity meets time, is the primum mobile, the first moved sphere. And then within them, you have the fixed stars, which is the 8th heaven, and then below that, you have the 7 planetary spheres. So Saturn, Jupiter, Mars, Sun, Venus, Mercury, Moon, and then finally, Earth at the centre. So if the divine realm is out here, Earth is the furthest removed from the divine realm, and so hence the need for the ascent of the soul through the planetary spheres to return to its divine origin. Now there is actually one place that's even further away from the divine realm than the surface of planet Earth, and that is the centre of the Earth, and that is known as Sheol, which is the deathly underworld. And as we'll see shortly, there's a very significant figure who ends up there. In fact, there's a couple of significant figures who end up there. One through accident, one by choice. Now, a really key point I want to stress at this point is that this idea of the ascent of the soul isn't to escape from the earth as the negative place and to go back to the divine origin as the positive place. It is for the soul to inhabit the whole cosmos. So to have their feet on the earth and their head up in heaven, you could say, symbolically so. So it's not about escaping here and going there. It's inhabiting the whole world rather than only the most material, the most manifest. All of those levels with the soul. This is Lady Philosophy, who's in Boethius' Consolation of Philosophy. She's there, she meets him in a prison cell when he's about to be executed and says that he needs her as the ladder of ascent, as in the ladder of inward ascent, so that he can actually remember his true self. So he doesn't need a ladder to escape from his prison. He needs a ladder to remind himself of his true self. Right, now here's what I'm talking about effectively. So it's the whole body being inhabited, someone becoming their true self, inhabiting all of those levels, inhabiting the whole cosmos. And of course there's that just direct analogy between these two images of the macrocosm and the microcosm. So it's not about escaping down below, going up above, inhabiting all those levels at the same time. Now here's a European image of that idea of chakras or points in the body. This is from the work of Gistel, who's a German mystic from about the 1700s. Now what he's done is put the actual planets at these points in the body. So the Sun is on the heart, Jupiter up on the brow, Saturn at the top. So, to the centre of the earth. It's Lucifer, the fallen angel, who falls to the centre of the earth. Now, Lucifer, the story of Lucifer has developed over the centuries, and what I'm going to talk about here is really the medieval Christian understanding of Lucifer. Lucifer becomes a slightly different figure with John Milton in Paradise Lost, and the Romantics after that, and then the occultists in Paris in the 1900s. There's a slightly more developed story, but I'm talking about the original version of Lucifer, the fallen angel, as described in the medieval era. Now he's high up in heaven, one of the brightest stars. He is planet Venus. Lucifer is the Roman name for the morning star, the light bringer, light bearer. But as a result of his pride, as a result of his egoic hubris, he ends up falling to the centre of the earth, to the furthest point that one can be from the divine realm. Now the thing about Venus is that Venus either rises in the east just before sunrise, or is setting in the west just after sunset. So Venus, I suppose all the stars are bleached out once the sun is above the horizon. But just before the sun rises and just after the sun sets, you can see Venus. Because Venus is essentially very close to the sun, going around the sun. So she's always in the realms of the sun. But you can only see her when the sun's no longer above the horizon. Here is Venus as the morning star. This was a photo I took when I opened up the curtains in my room in the morning, and there she was, a wonderful image with the moon. Now with this diagram, you need to imagine yourself being on Earth, and Earth is fixed in this position. Orbit of Earth around the Sun, orbit of Venus, Mercury, we're not looking at Mercury in this instance, and then Sun in the middle. So Earth is here. Now Venus is going faster around the Sun than Earth. So you can say that Venus is just very slowly moving around and eventually catches up with Earth and passes in between Earth and the Sun. And that's this period of time here. About 8 days it takes for her to pass in front of the Sun. And obviously we don't see her at that point because the Sun, the glare is so bright. Then she appears on this side of the Sun, and for 263 days, as she goes around here, she's the morning star. So that's when we see her in the morning, just after or just before the Sun rises. Now after those 263 days, she passes behind the Sun, and that takes about 50 days where we don't see her. And then she appears again as the evening star, and another 263 days as the evening star. So for those periods of time, you've got these 263 days of Venus rising, and then the equivalent opposite, Venus setting. Now these two movements of Venus, they come into so many different traditions, including Christianity. Christianity is one of the traditions that uses them. Lucifer is one example of the story. So first he rises in the east, but egoically so. He attempts to raise his ego to equality with God. So the inevitable outcome of that is that he falls down into the underworld. Now what Christ then does is the opposite movement. He first voluntarily goes down into the underworld to free all that's trapped and dead within the soul, to bring it up into the light, and then he rises gloriously as the morning star. So these two storylines are essentially two stages of the same journey. So even though they're two different figures, it's part of that same journey, which no doubt all of us need to go through. I've certainly gone through the Luciferian one on several occasions. I try not to now. But we all fall into that trap. I haven't quite got the second part of the journey yet, but I'm trying. But that is one example. Now, other examples of the morning star in Christianity, the Virgin Mary is the morning star, because she reflects the light of the sun down to us before the sun has risen above the horizon. So that's one of her titles. John the Baptist, for a very similar reason, he's also known as Bright Morning Star, because both the Virgin Mary and John the Baptist precede the sun, precede Christ. So that's why they're called Morning Star. But it's these focus, so these risings and settings, which are the ones I'm going to focus on, Christ and Lucifer, because they're the ones that appear in the design of the cathedral at Wells. Right, you recognise this from earlier. Here's the 8-pointed star. That's the second one that you drew in the session that you did. This is from an ancient Babylonian study. This is how Ishtar, or Venus, is depicted as the 8-pointed star, but is plotted out by Venus over an 8-year cycle. Right, let's look at Lucifer's story. It's mentioned in Isaiah, and Isaiah is actually talking about someone called the King of Babylon. Now the King of Babylon is, you could say, I suppose, the corrupt earthly world. So hence why Rastafarians talk about Babylon as being the corrupt place. So the King of Babylon is the king of the corrupt earthly world. And that then becomes associated with this idea of a fallen angel called Lucifer. How you are fallen from heaven, O Lucifer, son of the morning. How you are cut down to the ground, you who weakened the nations. For you have said in your heart, I will ascend into heaven. I will exalt my throne above the stars of God. I will also sit on the mount of the congregation on the farthest sides of the north. I will ascend above the heights of the clouds. I will be like the Most High. Yet you shall be brought down to Sheol, to the lowest depths of the pit. So rather like the wheel of fortune, when someone feels very proud of being at the top, the next thing that they experience is falling down to the bottom. That which was highest becomes that which was lowest. In this image of the planetary spheres, you can see the mouth of death at the centre. And indeed, Jonah Jonah's whale that he goes into is also called Sheol. So when Jonah is swallowed by the whale, he's swallowed up by death itself and down at the deepest part of the ocean. So as I mentioned earlier, these are the two stages of Lucifer. First, the hubristic ascent as the morning star, followed by the humiliating descent as the evening star. And of course, humiliating, if we think of it in the positive sense, humility is where the word humility, I suppose, is connected. And so in that sense, through the falling down to the lowest point, there is a possibility of humility, which then makes the possibility of ascending as the morning star more so. So he falls to the centre of the earth, the lowest depths of the pit. Right, so to more about Venus. How many of you have heard of the Venus pentagram? I mean, I've talked about the octagram, but the Venus pentagram. Venus plots out both a pentagram star and an octagram star over the course of an 8-year cycle. Now this is taken from a geocentric view, Earth at the centre, so not quite so straightforward to sort of understand what's going on there, but you can see the five-fold pattern. Now the reason for the five-fold pattern is because the amount of time it takes for Earth and Venus to go around the Sun approximates what's known as the golden ratio. Now the golden ratio naturally manifests as a five-fold pattern in a circle. So inevitably you're going to get five-fold symmetry when you have the particular planetary orbits of Earth and Venus, because they approximate this golden ratio. Now, as I've mentioned, there's also the Venus octagram as well. These two images are both from the Little Book of Coincidences, which is a book by John Martineau, who's the one who published my book. I know him from the Prince's School. He publishes wooden books, which you may have come across. Now here's how they work. So the Venus pentagram will say that Earth and Venus are level with one another, an inferior conjunction, as it would be called, when they're in a straight line, with the Sun in the middle. Now after 1.6 years, 584 days, that is, they pass again at this point. So what's happened is Earth has gone around like that and stopped there, whereas Venus has gone around one whole time and a bit more, and so they pass each other here. So we'll draw a line from there to there. Now another 1.6 years later, they pass again here. Another 1.6 years, and again, and again. So this is the Venus pentagram, this is how it works. 1.6 times 5 equals 8, because it's an 8-year cycle. Now the Venus octagram works in a slightly different way. Here they are again, conjuncting. Now it happens once every year. You look at where Venus is on the same day every year. So obviously that means when Earth returns back to the starting point, we look at where Venus is. So after 1 year, Earth is back at the starting point, Venus has gone around one full time and ended up here. So we draw a line. Now another year passes, and another, and so on. Now you should recognise this because you drew it earlier. So that is the Venus pentagram and the Venus octagram. And as I mentioned, of course, there you have the octagram on the Babylonian stele. Now this is what you're going to see tomorrow morning. I think where the coach drops you off is pretty much, you sort of walk around the corner and you're presented with this wonderful west front of the cathedral here in Wales. Now this is the main study of my book. For those who've seen the book, you'll be aware of this already, but this, the ground plan of this cathedral is what has really possessed me for years now, for 12, 13 years. And the first thing I found actually was the pentagram at the east end. Now let's just take a look at all this geometry. We'll just look at these basic coordinates here, and there's so much in here. All harmoniously united. It's very interesting how it all works. There's a Freemason lodgum, what appears to be a reference to the Templars in Jerusalem, Dante's Divine Comedy. All of these things can be seen within this very simple geometric plan. So let's look at the east end, the Lady Chapel, dedicated to the Virgin Mary, because it's a Lady Chapel. There we have the pentagonal east end. Now when we turn it into a pentagram star and we put in these axes, so this is obviously the main central axis of the whole building. This gives you the central axes of the side aisles, and the arms give you the central axes of these transept chapels. Now what you inevitably end up with is a golden ratio relationship, lesser to greater, 1 to 1.618. Now that's this golden ratio I was mentioning earlier. Bearing in mind that the whole of this is the Lady Chapel, so this pentagon, it only covers the east end of the Lady Chapel. You've got all this area down here. Now you can probably see what I'm going to do with it, because you can probably see what the shape of the rest of the chapel is. I'm going to draw another circle. The circle that contains this is obviously centred there, but I'm going to put the centre here, at the bottom of the pentagon, and put in the same circle again. Now if you look up here, I'll bring in the octagram star. There's the Star of Ishtar. That will now go into this circle, like so. Now if you look back up at this blue star again, I'll reduce it back to just the octagon, and I'll do the same thing here. And you can see how very clearly the chapel is pentagon and octagon. So the two shapes plotted out by the planet Venus. In a chapel dedicated to the Virgin Mary, who is morning star, at the east end of the building where the morning star rises with the sun. Now here is the Lady Chapel. Up in the middle of the dome is actually an image of the risen Christ, because of course the risen Christ is the bright morning star, and that's part of that symbolism of resurrection, again, in the east. Another symbolism associated with the Lady Chapel, and I suppose you could say the east more generally, is it being the location of Eden. So the Garden of Eden is in the Far East. And this is how Eden is depicted. Oh, actually, before I talk about that, I'll talk about a bit more about the Virgin Mary. As well as being morning star, she's also thornless rose, and that is an association with Eden. What's said is that roses grew in the Garden of Eden until the fall, and that's when thorns began to grow on the roses. Now this goes back to a very early, sort of like a symbolic storyline in early Christianity. And so the Virgin Mary as the thornless rose is essentially, I suppose you could say, the personification of the soul in its Edenic state, or the soul having returned back to its true state, which is the Edenic state. Now, I don't know if any of you are from Roman Catholic backgrounds, but these rosary beads, they're part of a veneration to the Virgin Mary, because it's in the name, rose. They're fivefold, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. They have this fivefoldness to them, as does the rose, because the rose, the wild rose, is fivefold. There's 5 sepals, 5 petals. But the very interesting thing about this in relation to the Venusian symbolism is, of course, the rose is the flower of Venus. Here we have the glyph symbol of Venus in alchemy, which is, of course, the same shape as the rosary beads. Now, there's nothing, I don't know, controversial about this. The medieval church were completely into astrology, except for fortune telling. That was the only part of astrology that they didn't like, because I suppose people would say, well, I'm not going to make an effort in life because it's all in the stars. And it's the same in various other religious traditions as well. There was a concern about fortune telling, but all other parts of astrology were part of what was accepted. And so hence the association of Eden with the east, with where the thornless rose. There's this garland of roses going around the chapel that I'll point out to you tomorrow. Right, this is the Hereford Mappamundi. Jerusalem in the middle, centre of the world, Europe down here, going eastwards to Eden. So Eden is always depicted in the Far East, this circle up here. This is in Hereford Cathedral, not that far from here, this old world map. Now here is Eden, a close-up of Eden, as we just looked at there. They're the 4 rivers running from Eden. Now this, I assume, is Lucifer. I don't know for sure, no one's actually said that. But it must be, because he's falling, he's upside down. And that is, you know, the story of Lucifer falling is often very much associated with the fall from Eden as well, as if it's part of the same storyline. But Eden, again, in the east, equating naturally with the Lady Chapel in the east. Now let's go down to the nave, so the beginning of the journey. The journey of ascent, of course, has to begin from the earthly world. That's where we find ourselves. That's where the journey begins. But of course, when we go into the nave, and we're in planet Earth, in a sense, we're walking through planet Earth from one side to the other. But I'll come back to that in a second. Let's just look at this more closely first. The axial tilt of Earth is 23.4 degrees. So between the tropics of Cancer and Capricorn, you have this line that's 23.4 degrees. Now that is what you get when you have a rectangle which is 13 by 30. And that's what the rectangle of the nave is. You actually multiply those numbers by 5 and then you get the footage. So these diagonals of the nave are running at 23.4 degrees. So when you first enter the cathedral, you're walking through the earth. You begin here. There's the image of the nave. So as you're first going into the nave, you're descending into the underworld. It doesn't look very underworldly, fair enough, it's rather beautiful, but you're descending lower and lower until you reach the centre of the earth. Of course, this is where Lucifer is. Now, on, I think it was the spring equinox back in 2019, it so happened it was the spring equinox, I thought, well, God, I mean, look at Dante's Divine Comedy, Lucifer's at the centre of the earth. Is there something Luciferian at the centre of the nave in Wells Cathedral? So I went and had a look. These are the pillars here. So, that's just how I've divided up the ground plan of the nave. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That's 5 of the bays, and then 5 more here. This is the centre of the earth. This pillar here is the one we're looking at. That one there. So it's the nearest one to the centre of the earth, and there is Lucifer. Now you'll notice he's got this eye-shaped hole in the brow of his crown, his serpentine crown. And this is like that storyline that you get in the German Grail myths of Lucifer losing an emerald from his crown when he falls. And of course the emerald is the gem of the planet Venus as well, so it's another one of these Venusian myths. Now he's presented as, I suppose you could say, an amalgam of different animal features, which is a very common way of depicting him. So he's sort of got pig-type ears, a goatee beard, serpentine crown. But you could say he's viewing the person who is approaching the centre of the earth, but you go past him and you move beyond him and move further east. But we have to face him before we can do that. Now this is Dante's journey. In his poem, in his Divine Comedy, he first goes from Jerusalem, descends into hell, down this funnel, passes Lucifer at the centre of the earth, and this is that pivotal point. This is where he stops descending and starts ascending, because of course he starts coming out of the earth. He passes the centre of gravity at the centre of the earth. He actually mentions this in the storyline. And then he reaches Eden, eventually, which is up the mountain of Purgatory. So you have Eden in the Far East, you could say, and then his journey through the planetary spheres. Now, the way in which we can see something very similar to this in the cathedral, you can see how Earth is there very clearly, but this ascent to Eden is then up here. Now, in between those two, you have something that isn't in Dante's Divine Comedy, but it is something very Masonic, and that is the choir. Now this, the heart of the cathedral, the central place, is the same shape and size as the Temple of Solomon. A 1x3 rectangle, and it is 60 cubits in length as well, which is the length of the temple as described in the Bible. Now there are also these two pillars here, which are right in the middle of a processional route, and so it's always said, what are they doing there? They're in a bit of a funny position. But they do happen to be in the correct position to be the the pillars of the temple, Yakin and Boaz. I'm just going to take a slight digression here. This is an image of the Temple Mount. Now, the understanding of the Temple Mount in the 12th century, during the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the Al-Aqsa Mosque was known as the Temple of Solomon, and it's where the Knights Templar were based. Immediately to the north, you have the Dome of the Rock, which, as you probably know, is an octagonal building. It's an Islamic shrine, symbolising the ascent of Prophet Muhammad. So with the Temple of Solomon here, and an octagonal building to the north, that's essentially what you have going on here, with the Temple of Solomon and an octagonal building to the north. And as we'll see shortly, they're connected geometrically and symbolically. So this is an allusion to the Templars on the Temple Mount. And this is exactly the time. The cathedral is designed at the time that the Templars are in the Al-Aqsa Mosque. Now, bearing in mind that the tropics of Cancer and Capricorn, they're the two parts of Earth where the sun is closest on the two solstices. So summer solstice, the sun's closest to the Tropic of Cancer. Winter solstice, or our northern hemisphere winter solstice, it's closest to the Tropic of Capricorn. So these are the solstitial extremes. So you have these solstitial pathways leading up to these two chapels. Now these two chapels are dedicated to solstitial saints. One to John the Baptist, who is midsummer, and one to Stephen, who is midwinter. So that also fits this particular cosmic design of the extremes of light and dark. And then the middle path between them, which of course is the equator of Earth, which would relate to the equinox, that is the one that actually goes through the Temple of Solomon and rises in the Lady Chapel as the bright morning star. And Easter is of course calculated according to the spring equinox. First Sunday after the first full moon, after the spring equinox. So you have sun on one side, moon on the other, the middle part of the equinox, that's Easter. Now, loads of information here, I know. I mean, it's all in the book as well, so it's a bit more digestible in the book, but I'm fitting as much in as I can. Now, the final stage, the ascent into heaven, if this equates with the eastern end of Wells Cathedral, you can't go beyond the eastern end of a building, so what happens with the ascent into heaven? Well, that, in my opinion, goes northwards. So if that's the ascent eastwards to Eden, this is the ascent into the heavens. And of course, the ascent into the heavens goes northwards because the celestial North Pole, the point that denotes that northern point, is at the centre of the eighth heaven of the fixed stars. So the movement northwards, you could say the movement towards the polar mountain in the north, which is one of these ideas you get in lots of traditions. The ascent into heaven moves northwards. Now this was the most surprising bit for me. This was one of the first things I found years and years ago. This is a pyramid triangle. And this pyramid triangle is basically 1/5 of the size of the Great Pyramid. You may be aware of a diagram discovered by someone called John Michel. He discovered it about 1970, I think. And then immediately came to Bath, just where you've been today, and spent 2 years writing City of Revelation. Because he just found this amazing relationship. If this is the earth, this is the moon. Now, he didn't know about all this stuff in Wells Cathedral, and unfortunately I found this about a year after he died, so I never managed to show him. But when you turn the moon into the square, then you get the moon square, and you have this diagram. Have you seen this diagram before? Is this familiar?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
I've got various talks about this diagram. It would take too long to go through. It's a bit late at night, I don't want to make you fall asleep. There's lots of very concordant numbers. I failed my maths exam when I was 16, so you don't need to be particularly good to understand them, but there's a lot of numbers to digest, and it all works if you use English miles. You get these amazing number patterns when you look at the size of the Earth to the moon. So I won't say any more detail about that, but that's worth looking into, very definitely. And it seems to be used here. Now, the various things that demonstrate it must be being used are the aspects of lunar symbolism that happen around here, and we'll look at all these tomorrow when we go to the cathedral. Now, before we look at those, let's just look at another cathedral, because you've been to York, haven't you? You went there, was it yesterday or the day before? Now, I don't know if any of you would have seen it. You'd have to probably know it's there, unless perhaps it was pointed out to you. The chapter house at York is slightly skewed in its orientation. Now, as you walk towards it, if you sort of know it's skewed, you can see it. But if you don't know, then you probably wouldn't see it. And that's really part of the way these things often work. You don't see it. It's a little skew. But it is skewed by about 5 degrees. And it also works with John Michel's diagram. But the thing about that skew of just over 5 degrees is that that is something that the moon actually does. It's what's known as the inclination of the moon. Now this has been known, like we know it's been known since at least 200 BC, but it could have been known before that. You don't need modern technology to find it. The Greek astronomer Hipparchus, he worked it out. 5.15 degrees. It's, if this is the orbital plane of Earth around the Sun, then this is the orbital plane of the moon around the Earth. And it's slightly off compared to Earth around the Sun. So the fact that you have a lunar chapter house with that degree of skewage is immediately of interest. Now let's return to Wells again. This isn't skewed, but that is by just over 5 degrees. So this is lunar. This is lunar. And as for this, now I won't even describe the staircase, you have to experience it. It's beautiful. It's one of the most beautiful pieces of ground that there is. Before I'll show you that. This is that vestibule that we were just looking at. And you can see there's that 5.15 degree skew. This is the peak of the arch coming up the staircase. This is the peak of the arch going into the octagonal area. Now this is very close to Margaret Barker actually. I don't know if it's in Sherwood Forest, and there's lots of green men inside the chapter house, near Lincoln, that sort of area. And this is the other one that seems to also have John Michel's diagram. Now this is the Gothic part of the building, which is where you find the diagram. So again, you've got the chapter house with the moon area. Now I looked for a skew in the architecture and it's not there, so I thought, oh, perhaps they don't have that sort of angle. But eventually, of course, I realised that the door is off-centre. Seat on that side, nothing on that side. This pillar is at the golden section of the wall. Or if you be really fussy, it's actually at the 13/8 Fibonacci division. So it is the golden section, but everything is rational in these cathedrals. They don't have the irrational measures, they have rational versions of them. So what it means is that if this is 13 feet from here to here, then that's 8 feet. And so it approximates the golden section, where you have the lesser to the greater. Now, by being there, you can arithmetically calculate that if this is the central axis of the building, this goes to the pillar in the doorway, and that gives you 5.15 degrees. So the golden section gives you the lunar skew. Now I only found that just a few months before I published the book. I wasn't expecting that to be there. I was constantly having to rejig my thinking all the time, because if I got fixed into anything, I thought, oh, that's how they do that, so I'll look for that everywhere else. But I was constantly having to look anew, because it's different in each place, but you have the same underlying relationship going on. Now this staircase, this photo doesn't do it justice. Wait till you see it tomorrow. It's very beautiful. There's a wonderful curve in the staircase. This is back to Wells again. So there's that skewed vestibule we were just looking at. Here's the staircase. Now in this staircase, another lunar aspect of it is that in the staircase there's 29.5 steps. Or you can count 29.5 steps. There's a half step at the beginning. So that's the amount of days in the lunar cycle, or the lunar phase, as you probably know. The thing is, you can also count 27.1/3 steps as well, which is what's known as the sidereal cycle of the moon. So these two different cycles of the moon are both in that staircase. I'll show you how that works. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 27, you see how that's the last step that takes part in both of the staircase routes. So you've got a staircase route going into the chapter house, you've got another staircase route going up there. And it's the one with which the staircase achieves the right angle. So it's as if you get the set square once you get to that stage. So you have 27 as a significant number. Now 2 more steps, 28 and 29, delivers you into the vestibule. So you have 27 and 29. Now let's come down to this step down here, which as you can see, it's not quite half, but it's just a bit under half. Now there it is in the doorway. So we'll look at this area of steps here, like so. First few steps. Now for reasons that will become apparent shortly, I'm dividing this step up into 12 equal parts. Now the reason for this is so that I can then say that 6/12 is of course a half. That's too much. The porridge is too hot. 4/12, porridge is too cold. So the arithmetic mean between a half and a third is 5/12. And so you have both a half and a third in the one step. How else would you put a half and a third into the same thing at the same time? How else could you do it other than we're having 2 separate things, one being a half, one being a third? That seems to be the way that they've done that. So you have 27 and a third, 29 and a half. And the accuracy of this is to about 1/4 of an inch. It's really, really accurate. So that, I suppose, is another thing that suggests it is their intention. And what I mean is this being 5/12 of this when you measure those 2 distances. Okay, coming towards the end now, so I've given so much information, just a bit more to come. But I mentioned how this is effectively 1/5 of the size of the Great Pyramid. So that's the Wells Triangle. There's the Wells Triangle, that's the Great Pyramid. Now, Southall is smaller, it's 1/6. So that's the Southall Triangle, Great Pyramid. At York, which as you know is massive, I mean Wells is a lot smaller than York, we'll see that as soon as you go in tomorrow. This is a type of golden ratio measure, I won't go into detail on it, 1/√5. Now I won't go any more than that because I've given a lot of information already, but it's basically part of the golden ratio system. Now let's imagine that all these pyramid triangles I'm saying there, they may work, but there's no physical evidence that there's any pyramid geometry. It might just be that it is there by coincidence. Well, what I'd say to that is that there is actually one physically existing pyramid triangle, one made of stone, but it would have been hidden to the medieval human eye. So you can say that it's as hidden as all of the geometry that underlies the ground plans of the cathedrals. Now the reason why it wouldn't have been visible to the human eye is because they didn't have satellite or aviation technology, which we can now use to look down on what is this massive pyramid triangle surrounding Bishop's Palace. Now the length of each one of these walls is 280 cubits, which is the height of the Great Pyramid. This is built in about the early 1200s. Pyramid triangle. Like I say, that is 280 cubits. Obviously the height of the pyramid triangle, of the Great Pyramid, would be if you have 280 cubits like that. So let's imagine, I get our compasses, but the point of the compass is there, swing this measurement up like that, so that you can get the complete pyramid triangle. That's the Great Pyramid, the size of it. Now look at the palace building. Now you can define arithmetically that this distance is 60 cubits, this is 220 cubits. Now what I did, I went in here with my laser measurer, measured the internal distance from wall to wall, and it's about half an inch off 60 cubits. So again, it fits, because obviously a geographical diagram like this can't be really, really accurate. You have to go and actually measure it in situ. But in situ, it's very good. put in this opposing pyramid triangle, it ends up right in the middle of the octagon in the Lady Chapel. And this is built a lot later. This is built in the early 1300s, but this is part of, like with the art historians, they don't like the stuff I say because they say, oh, well, what are you talking about? You know, that was built much later, it's got nothing to do with that. But with design rationale, mathematics, measure, you can demonstrate that it must be part of all one design. It just took a long time to build. Right, PS, postscript. Remember this, I talked about this earlier. This is something I thought I'd put in because of what you're dealing with in your tour. I've talked about how this and this is like an image of the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, the Templars in the Temple of Solomon, the octagonal dome of the rock to the north. I'm just going to show you a bit of latitude geometry. Now, I won't go into too much detail with this, but you're looking at planet Earth, and this, of course, is 0 degrees latitude, the equator. Now, imagine if we turn this into a pyramid triangle, like so. And we take the angle of the pyramid triangle, which is 51 degrees and 50 minutes. And what that would mean is that the latitude of here, if this is 0 degrees latitude, this is 51 degrees 50 minutes latitude. Now that is where the first manner of land is that was given to the Templars in this country. No one's pointed this out yet, so it's a fascinating thing. So in decimal degrees, if you convert that into decimals, I have to because what I'm going to show you does things in decimal. Now here's the geographical diagram from Google Maps, 51.8427. This is the first manor of, this is the centre of the manor of land. This is where what's known as the Cressing Temple Barns, and this is the latitude in question. That's 51 degrees 50 minutes. But it covers the whole of this area here. So you've got that pyramid angle for the first bit of land given to the Templars. Now the second bit of land given to them, which is just outside Oxford, Temple Cowley, that also corresponds to another pyramid angle latitude. Now I'm pretty sure that's the end. Here's the book. Have the book if you haven't got it already. You can digest it much more gradually over a longer period of time rather than loads of information over the course of an hour. There is one more thing that I should show you because I'm going to go to Stonehenge. I'll just very quickly show it to you. I just have to go to another programme. Now John Michel's diagram, what he's pointed out is that these two circles, the Earth circle, and then this one is the one that goes, this one is the same measurement as this square, which is known as the squaring of the circle. I won't go into detail on that. But they correspond to these two main circles at Stonehenge. The outer circle to this circle, and then the bluestone circle there to this circle. Now they also correspond to the mileage, which again I haven't gone into the mileage numbers, I won't go into them. But just to say that this diagram does seem to be used at Stonehenge as well. And the latitude of Wells and Glastonbury, they're on either side of the Stonehenge latitude. You know, it's about 5 miles from Glastonbury here. But the Stonehenge latitude passes in between Wells above, Glastonbury below. So I thought I'd drop that one in. I want to finish with my final slide after the book. The most important one of all.